As soon as she stepped away to ask for directions, the bank clerk suddenly dropped a stack of documents and rushed around her counter. As she crouched near my feet to gather them, she tilted her head up and whispered, her voice trembling, "Listen carefully. They're deceiving you. Whatever happens tonight, don't drink the tea." I froze, unable to understand what she meant. It wasn't until that evening, when my wife walked into my study carrying my usual cup of tea, that I realized the warning had been meant for me all along. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Now, before this story begins, tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from? I read every single one. A quick note: some elements of this story are fictional, crafted to bring the message to life. Names and locations are not drawn from any specific person or place, but the lesson at the heart of this story is one worth carrying. The cane was the first thing I reach for every morning. Not my glasses, not my phone. The cane. It leaned against the nightstand, exactly where I placed it every night before bed, and every morning my right hand found it before my eyes were fully open. 43 years as an architect had taught me to rely on structure, on the things that held firm when everything else shifted. The cane was structured. It was reliable. It did not pretend to be something it was not. I was 65 years old, and I had learned to appreciate honesty in all its forms. "Raymond," Evelyn's voice drifted up from the kitchen, warm and familiar as the smell of coffee that followed it. "Breakfast is ready, honey. We need to leave by 9, or we'll hit traffic on Morrison Bridge." I dressed slowly, the way a man dresses when his right knee no longer bends the way God originally intended. A gray button-down shirt, dark trousers, the brown leather shoes Evelyn had polished for me the night before without being asked. 45 years of marriage had turned us into a single machine with two moving parts, each one anticipating the other without a word exchanged. Downstairs, the kitchen was full of morning light. Evelyn stood at the counter in her blue cardigan, the one with the small pearl buttons she'd had since Derek's college graduation. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly. She was slicing toast into triangles the way I liked, precise, and even the knife hitting the board in a steady rhythm. "You look tired," she said, glancing over her shoulder with a smile that creased the corners of her eyes. "Did you sleep all right?" "Well enough," I said, lowering myself into my chair at the kitchen table. My knee throbbed its usual morning complaint, and I pressed my palm against it, willing it quiet. "What time is our appointment at the bank?" 10 o'clock. She set the toast in front of me and poured coffee into my mug, the blue ceramic one I'd been drinking from since 1987. "Sandra Mills handles our account renewals. She's always very efficient. We'll be in and out in 30 minutes. I nodded and picked up my fork. Outside the kitchen window, the oak tree in our front yard was already turning its leaves, going amber at the edges. August in Portland moved slowly toward autumn, and the morning air carried that particular quality of light that always made me think of blueprints, of clean lines, of things not yet built. I had designed this house myself. Every beam, every window placement, every angle of the roof calculated to catch the afternoon sun. For 30 years, it had stood exactly as I intended. Solid, purposeful, mine. I had no reason that morning to feel anything other than ordinary. The Willamette Valley Bank on Burnside Street was a building I had always respected. Clean mid-century lines, good bones, the kind of architecture that said, "We intend to stay." The lobby smelled of cool air and polished wood, and the carpet was the deep burgundy that banks favored in the 1980s and apparently never saw a reason to change. Evelyn took my arm as we came through the glass doors, steadying me on the smooth floor without making a production of it. That was one of her gifts. She helped without making you feel helped. "There's the information desk," she said, nodding toward the far end of the lobby. "Let me ask them which window Sandra is at today." She gave my arm a gentle squeeze and stepped away, her heels clicking softly across the polished floor. I stood near the rope barrier and looked around the lobby. A young couple at one window, an older gentleman in a postal uniform at another. Ordinary Monday morning business, nothing remarkable about any of it. "Mr. Holt." The voice was low, almost too low. I turned. The young woman behind the nearest window was looking directly at me. Mid-30s dark hair pulled back from her face, a name tag that read, "Sandra Mills, Senior Account Associate." Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes were doing something different. They were moving rapidly from my face to the spot where Evelyn had been standing, then back to me. She dropped the folder she was holding. Papers scattered across her side of the counter and fanned out across the floor. "Oh, goodness!" she said loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. "I am so sorry, let me just—" She came around the side of the counter, quickly crouching to gather the papers, and as she did, she moved close to me, close enough that I could have counted the stitching on her collar. Her hands were shaking visibly as she gathered the papers into a stack, and then she tilted her head up toward mine, and her voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "Mr. Holt, listen to me very carefully." Her jaw was tight. Her knuckles had gone white around the folder's edge. "Tonight, whatever anyone brings you to drink at home, do not touch it. Do not drink it." She held my gaze with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "Don't trust anyone in that house. Please." She stood up in a single fluid motion, smoothed her jacket, and was back behind the counter before I could draw a full breath. "Here we are." She smiled at me the way bank employees smile, practiced, pleasant, revealing nothing. "Sorry about that, Mr. Holt. Mondays." My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was certain she could hear it. Evelyn's heels clicked back across the floor. "Third window on the left, sweetheart." She tucked her hand back under my arm and steered me gently in that direction. "Are you all right? You've gone a bit pale." "Fine," I said. The word came out steadier than I felt. "Just the knee." She patted my hand. "We'll get you home soon." I let her guide me toward the window. I smiled when Sandra processed our paperwork. I signed where Evelyn pointed. I said thank you and have a good week and all the other things a man says when he is functioning on the outside while something has come loose on the inside. Don't trust anyone in that house. The drive home took 22 minutes. Evelyn talked about stopping at the grocery on the way back, about a phone call she'd had with her sister, about whether the oak tree in the front yard needed trimming before the fall rains came. Her voice was easy and warm and filled the car the way it always had, like sunlight through a clean window. I looked at her hands on the steering wheel, the thin gold band on her left ring finger, the small scar on her thumb from the kitchen accident of 1994 that she'd refused to go to the hospital for insisting it was nothing laughing while I wrapped it in gauze and called her impossible. 45 years. She glanced over at me and smiled, the crow's feet deepening at the corners of her eyes. "You're quiet today." "Just thinking," I said. "About what?" I turned to look out the passenger window at the street passing by, at the ordinary houses and ordinary yards, and the ordinary Monday morning world moving around us without any idea that anything was wrong. "About the house," I said. "Whether the gutters need cleaning before winter." Evelyn laughed softly. "Always the architect." I nodded and said nothing else. When we pulled into the driveway, she got out first and came around to help me with the door the way she always did. And as I stood on the front path, looking up at the house I had designed and built and loved for 30 years, something moved through me that I had no name for yet. Something cold, something that had not been there this morning. Dinner that evening was pot roast. Evelyn had started it in the slow cooker before we left for the bank, and by the time we got home, the whole house smelled of it. Beef and rosemary, and the particular warmth of a meal that had been waiting patiently all day. She set the table the way she always did, cloth napkins folded into triangles, the good ceramic plates we'd received as a wedding gift and somehow never broken in 45 years. I sat across from her and ate, and I listened to her talk about her sister's upcoming visit, about the neighbor's new dog that kept digging under the fence about a documentary she wanted to watch after dinner. Her voice moved through the kitchen like water over smooth stones, easy, unhurried, completely natural, and I watched her hands. I had spent 40 years reading blueprints, training my eyes to find the detail that didn't belong, the measurement that was off by a fraction, the line that looked straight until you held a ruler against it. Now I sat at my own dinner table, and I used those same eyes on the woman I had shared a bed with since 1980, and I felt something in my chest pull tight like a cable under too much load. Her hands were steady. That was what frightened me most. Her hands were perfectly, completely steady. "You're not eating," Evelyn said, nodding at my plate. Her brow creased with the particular concern she'd always reserved for me. "Is the knee bad tonight?" "A little," I said. I picked up my fork and made myself take a bite. "The pot roast is wonderful." She smiled warm and genuine, and reached across the table to pat my hand. "I'll get you some ibuprofen after dinner." I smiled back at her. My jaw ached from the effort of it. She brought the tea at 8:15. I was in my study sitting at the drafting table. I kept more out of habit than necessity, turning the pages of an old project manual without reading a single word. The desk lamp cast a yellow circle of light across the room. Outside the window, the oak tree moved in the evening wind. The door opened, and Evelyn came in carrying a white ceramic mug, steam rising from it in a thin curl. She was wearing her gray robe, the soft one she'd had for years, and her silver hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked exactly like she had looked on 1,000 other evenings, exactly like the woman I had built my life around. "Chamomile," she said, setting the mug on the corner of the drafting table with a small smile. "You always sleep better when you have chamomile." "Thank you, sweetheart." My voice came out steady. I was proud of that. She squeezed my shoulder gently and moved toward the door. "Don't stay up too late. You know how your knee gets when you don't sleep." "I won't," I said. "Evelyn." She paused at the door and looked back at me, her hand resting on the frame. "Yes." I looked at her for a long moment. The yellow lamplight, the gray robe, the woman who had folded my laundry and argued with me about paint colors and held my hand at my mother's funeral and laughed at my bad jokes for 45 years. "Nothing," I said. "Good night." "Good night, honey." She pulled the door halfway closed behind her. I sat without moving until I heard her footsteps reach the end of the hallway and the bedroom door click shut. Then I picked up the mug. The tea was the pale gold color chamomile always was. It smelled exactly right. There was nothing about it that looked wrong in any way whatsoever, and that was precisely what made my hand begin to tremble as I held it. "Don't drink it." I opened the bottom drawer of the drafting table and pulled out the small steel thermos I kept there for long nights at the desk. I unscrewed the cap, and with a hand that would not stop shaking no matter how hard I willed it, still I poured every drop of that tea into the thermos and screwed the cap back on and set it at the very back of the drawer beneath a stack of old project files. Then I sat back in my chair and pressed both palms flat against my thighs and breathed. It was in that stillness that I remembered what I had pushed to the back of my mind all through dinner. 2 days ago, Sandra Mills had not been waiting for me at that bank window by accident. I had turned it over in the car, turned it over through the grocery stop Evelyn insisted on making, turned it over through dinner and the news program and all the ordinary machinery of our evening. And now, sitting alone in my study with a thermos of tea, I had not drunk hidden in my desk drawer, the pieces arranged themselves in front of me, with the cold clarity of a completed blueprint. Sandra had known my name before I said it. She had known I was coming. She had been afraid. The question with no answer yet was how. But the answer existed. And as I sat in the dark with a thermos of untouched tea hidden in my desk drawer, I understood that it lived somewhere very close to home. I had filled 3 pages of the notebook when I stopped writing and looked up at the bookshelf on the far wall of my study. There was a row of binders there, project files mostly going back 20 years, site surveys, material specifications, correspondence with contractors and city planning offices, the kind of documentation that accumulates over a career, and that you keep not because you expect to need it again, but because throwing it away feels like erasing something. Between the 3rd and 4th binder from the left, wedged in at an angle the way something gets wedged when it is put there quickly and without much thought, was a small notebook I did not recognize. It was dark green, smaller than my palm, the kind of notebook sold in drugstores near the checkout counter, the kind a person buys without thinking much about it. It was not mine. I set down my pen. My knee throbbed as I pushed myself up from the drafting chair, and I crossed the study in 9 steps and stood in front of the shelf and looked at the green notebook for a long moment without touching it. Then I reached out and pulled it free. The cover was unmarked. I opened it. The first page stopped my breath completely. It was Evelyn's handwriting. I would have known it anywhere. The slight leftward lean of her letters, the way she made her 7s with a crossbar through the middle, the way Europeans did a habit she'd picked up from her French grandmother and never lost. But the words themselves were not words. They were a system of marks, a private shorthand that the two of us had invented together in the early years of our marriage when we passed notes to each other across rooms at parties. A small secret language built for 2 people who wanted to say things without being overheard. I had not thought about that language in 30 years. My hands had gone very cold. I carried the notebook back to the drafting table and sat down and began to read. The first entries were dated 8 months ago, December of last year, when the oak tree in the front yard had been bare and the holiday decorations were still up on Morrison Street, and I had been cutting back my hours at the consulting firm, thinking about fishing trips, thinking about nothing in particular. Evelyn had been thinking about something very particular. The entries were methodical, precise, written in the shorthand of a woman who had once been a school teacher and understood that a well-organized plan was a plan that could be executed without error. She had documented Derek's debts in columns, amounts, creditors' dates, the name Victor Salazar, appearing first in January with a figure beside it that made my vision blur at the edges. $1.5 million. The number sat on the page in Evelyn's neat, cross-barred sevens like something out of a nightmare I had not known I was having. There were notes about the property, about the architectural rights to this house, rights that were mine that I had registered with the Oregon State Architects Board in 1994 and never thought about again, because why would I? They were mine, they would always be mine. Evelyn had researched their value. She had written down figures from real estate consultations I had known nothing about. She had made projections, page after page of projections. My throat tightened until swallowing became an act of conscious effort. I turned the pages slowly, carefully, the way you handle something that might fall apart if you grip it too hard. And then I found the page that broke something open inside me that I was not sure would ever fully close again. It was dated the 14th of February, Valentine's Day. I remembered that day. I had bought Evelyn roses from the shop, on Burnside yellow ones, her favorite, and she had put them in the blue vase on the kitchen windowsill and kissed me on the cheek and said I was the most predictable man she had ever loved. And I had laughed because she meant it as a compliment. We had eaten dinner at the Italian place on Thurman Street that we'd been going to since before Derek was born. She had ordered the linguine. I had ordered the veal. We had shared a piece of tiramisu. I held her hand across the table. On that same day in this notebook in our private language that she apparently remembered far better than I had, Evelyn had written, Phase 3 begins when Raymond shows sufficient cognitive signs. Target window 6 to 8 weeks. Finalize documentation. Coordinate Warren on medical certification. Move forward on signature by Friday of target week. Warren. I set the notebook down on the drafting table and pressed both hands flat against the wood surface and stared at the wall in front of me. My eyes were burning, not with tears exactly, but with something that lived in the same neighborhood as tears, something hot and pressurized that had nowhere to go. Warren. There was only one Warren that Evelyn and I both knew, Dr. Warren Pitts. We had met him at a university reunion 12 years ago, a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh and the kind of confidence that medical degrees seem to manufacture in bulk. He had clapped me on the back and called me old man the way people do when they are trying to disguise the fact that they feel inferior, and I had smiled and bought him a drink because that was what you did. What I had not told Evelyn that night, because I had never told anyone and saw no reason to, was that I had known Warren Pitts long before that reunion. I had known him in 1987, when he was a graduate student 3 months from finishing his medical thesis and completely out of money, and he had knocked on the door of my apartment on a Tuesday evening with his hat in his hands, metaphorically speaking, and asked if I could lend him $800. I had given it to him without hesitation. He had promised to pay it back. He never had. I had never asked. And now his name was written in my wife's handwriting, in a green notebook, hidden between my own project files in a plan that had been running for 8 months, while I ate pot roast and held Evelyn's hand across restaurant tables and believed with the complete and ordinary confidence of a man who has no reason to believe otherwise, that the life around him was exactly what it appeared to be. The study felt very small suddenly. The walls pressed inward. The yellow lamplight that had always seemed warm now seemed merely yellow, merely artificial, a poor substitute for something real. I picked up the notebook again and turned to the last written page. Phase 3 signature by Friday of target week. All documents prepared. Derek confirms Victor's deadline. This ends here. This ends here. I read those 3 words 4 times. Then I closed the notebook carefully exactly as I had found it, and I stood up and walked back to the bookshelf and wedged it back between the 3rd and 4th binders at exactly the same angle I had found it. I stood there with my hand still resting on the spine of the notebook, and I let myself feel for exactly 60 seconds everything that was trying to come through me at once. The grief of it, the disbelief of it, the 45 years of mornings and dinners and arguments about nothing and laughter in the dark that now had to be recalibrated against this, against Phase 3, against Coordinate Warren on medical certification. I had designed structures that were meant to outlast the people who built them. I had calculated load tolerances and stress distributions and the precise amount of pressure a foundation could bear before it failed. I had always believed that the most dangerous force in any structure was not what came from outside, not the storm, not the earthquake, but what grew from within. The invisible crack, the flaw in the material that looked sound until it didn't. I had just found the crack. Now I needed to decide what to do with it. I went back to my chair. I picked up my pen. I did not write anything for a long time, just sat with the pen between my fingers and the blank page in front of me and the sound of the house around me. The refrigerator hum, the wind in the oak tree, the distant settling of old wood in the walls. Then I turned to a fresh page in my notebook, and I wrote one name, Frank Dalton, and underneath it I wrote tomorrow night. Tell him everything. The clock on the study wall read 11:47. I turned off the desk lamp. I sat in the dark for a while, listening to the house breathe around me, this house I had built to last, this house, with the crack running through its foundation that I had only just found. Then I heard the bedroom door open down the hall. Raymond, Evelyn's voice soft and drowsy, drifting through the dark. Honey, are you coming to bed? I closed my notebook. I just finishing up, I called back, and my voice came out so perfectly ordinary that for one terrible vertiginous moment, I wondered if she was doing the same thing, answering from the same great controlled distance, saying the right words in the right tone, while something entirely different moved underneath. Then I decided it did not matter. What mattered was what happened next. Be right there, I said. I did not sleep. I lay on my side of the bed in the dark and listened to Evelyn breathe beside me, that slow and steady rhythm I had fallen asleep to for 45 years, and I stared at the ceiling and felt the hours move past me one by one. At some point, after 2 a.m, her breathing deepened and her shoulder relaxed, and I knew she was genuinely asleep, not performing sleep the way I was performing it, and that knowledge sat in my chest like a stone I could not dislodge. At 5:15 I got up, dressed in the dark, took my cane from the nightstand with the particular care of a man who has learned that the smallest sounds carry farthest in a quiet house. Downstairs I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the backyard come slowly into shape as the sky lightened. The garden Evelyn had planted along the back fence, the 2 chairs on the patio where we sat on summer evenings, the bird feeder I had built from scrap lumber the winter before last, crooked at the base because my knee had been bad that day, and I had not taken the time to level it properly. Ordinary things. Things I had stopped seeing because they were always there. I was going to have to learn to see everything again. Evelyn came downstairs at 7, dressed and alert, her silver hair pinned back in its usual way. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at me with the particular expression she wore when she thought I needed managing. You look terrible, she said, but her voice was gentle. Did you sleep at all? A few hours, I said. The lie came easily, which disturbed me more than the lie itself. Your knee keeping you up again? I lifted my mug. I might go over the Henderson Project files this morning. Keep my mind occupied. She nodded, satisfied with this, and began opening cabinet doors in the efficient morning rhythm I knew by heart. I'm going to the market around 10. We're out of chamomile. My hand tightened around the mug handle just slightly, just for a half second. Take your time, I said. I'll be in the study. She smiled at me over her shoulder. I'll make something good for dinner. You always do, I said. I watched her move around the kitchen, and I thought about 45 years, and I thought about phase 3, and I thought about the way she had said, we're out of chamomile, with exactly the same casual tone she used to say, we're out of milk, or we need more dish soap. And I understood with a clarity that felt like cold water poured over the top of my head that whatever Evelyn had become in the service of protecting our son, she had become it so completely that even she might not be able to see where it had happened. That was the most frightening thing of all. She left for the market at 10:10. I heard her car back out of the driveway, and I stood at the front window and watched it until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then I went to the study. I was not looking for anything specific. I was looking the way an architect looks at a completed structure when something feels wrong, but the blueprints all say it should be fine, methodically, systematically, starting from the ceiling and working down. I checked the bookshelves, the filing cabinet, the space behind the curtains. I ran my hand along the top of the door frame and checked the back corners where the walls met the ceiling and looked at every object in the room that could reasonably conceal something that should not be there. I found it in 4 minutes. The smoke detector on the ceiling above my drafting table was a model I did not recognize. I had installed smoke detectors in this house myself. 22 years ago, I knew their make and model the way I knew every specification in every structure I had ever been responsible for. This one was newer, slightly different housing, a small indicator light that blinked at an interval that did not match any smoke detector I had ever seen. I pulled my drafting stool under it and climbed up carefully, my bad knee protesting the whole way, and I looked at it from 6 inches away. There was a lens. It was small, barely 3 millimeters in diameter, set into the housing at an angle that gave it a clear view of the entire room. The drafting table, the bookshelves, the chair I sat in every evening, the desk lamp, every square foot of the space where I spent most of my waking hours at home. My jaw tightened so hard, I felt it in my back teeth. I climbed down from the stool. I set it back in its place at the drafting table. I straightened the project manual I had moved 2 inches to the left when I climbed up, putting it back exactly where it had been. I walked to the window and stood with my back to the camera and breathed through my nose until my pulse settled back below the level where I might do something I would regret. Then, I turned around and looked at it. Someone had been watching me in this room, watching me work, watching me read, watching me sit alone at my drafting table in the evenings and do the thing I had apparently done without knowing anyone was paying attention. I had talked to her photograph. The photograph of Evelyn that sat on the corner of the bookshelf, the one from our trip to the Oregon coast in 2019, her laughing at something I had said, the ocean behind her, gray and enormous. I had talked to it on the bad nights. The nights when the knee was terrible and the house was quiet, and I missed in some way. I did not have precise language for the version of us that existed before. Time had made us so familiar to each other that we had stopped being surprised. I had said her name out loud in this room. I had asked her questions that I knew she couldn't answer, and it had been recorded. The fury that moved through me then was not hot the way anger usually is. It was cold and structural, the kind of feeling that does not burn itself out, but instead organizes itself, finds its load-bearing points, settles into something that can be sustained over time. I knew exactly what they intended to do with that footage, a confused old man talking to photographs, not recognizing the boundary between the living and the dead. Further evidence of cognitive decline that required intervention. I looked at the camera for a long moment. Then I did the thing that every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to do. I left it exactly where it was, because here was what 40 years of architecture had taught me about structures under threat. You do not demolish the wall that is failing. You shore it up from the inside. You make it appear sound while you rebuild the foundation underneath it. You give the structure what it expects, stability, normalcy, the ordinary continuation of things, while you do your real work where no one is watching. They wanted footage of a confused old man. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I sat down at my drafting table and opened the Henderson project manual and stared at it without reading it. And in the back of my mind, quiet and precise as a calculation running in the background, I began to build the thing I actually needed. A counterstructure, something load-bearing, something that could hold the weight of what was coming. I reached into the bottom drawer and moved the thermos aside and took out the small secondary phone. I kept there an old handset I had never connected to our home network, purchased for cash at an electronics store 2 years ago when I was working on a sensitive contract and wanted a clean line of communication with the client. It had a 12% battery. I plugged it into the charger I kept in the same drawer and waited. Then I picked it up and scrolled to the one contact I had saved in it. Frank Dalton, the only person in my life who had known me longer than Evelyn had. My thumb hovered over the call button. From upstairs, somewhere in the ceiling above me, the small light on the camera blinked its steady, patient blink. "All right," I said quietly enough that no microphone could have caught it over the ambient noise of the house. I was talking to myself, or to the room, or to the 40 years of work and love and careful construction that surrounded me on every wall. Let's see how this holds. I found Derek's password on the 3rd try, his mother's birthday. Month and year, no spaces. It was exactly the kind of password a man chooses when he wants to believe he is being sentimental rather than lazy. And it was exactly the kind of thing I would have known without thinking, because I was his father, and I had watched him type it on a shared computer once at Thanksgiving 3 years ago, and filed it away in the part of my mind that retained small details without being asked to. 40 years of architectural work will do that to you. You learn to remember the measurements that other people consider insignificant. I sat at the drafting table with the secondary phone in my hand and Derek's email account open on the screen, and I felt something cold and methodical settle over me like a second skin. I did not want to read what was in there. Every part of me that was still his father, still the man who had caught him when he fell off his bicycle on a Sunday afternoon in 1995, wanted to close the application and put the phone back in the drawer and choose not to know. But I had already chosen. I had chosen the moment I poured that tea into the thermos. I began to read. The emails went back 14 months. The earliest ones were from an address I did not recognize, a string of numbers at a domain that resolved when I searched it on the secondary phone's browser, to a private financial services company registered in Nevada with no public-facing website and no listed officers. The emails were brief and businesslike and discussed sums of money the way doctors discuss symptoms clinically without effect, as though the numbers themselves were not extraordinary. But the numbers were extraordinary. The first email referenced a debt of $380,000, securities fraud. That was the phrase used plainly and without euphemism in the third paragraph of an email dated the previous June. Derek had apparently attempted to manipulate the price of a micro-cap stock through a series of coordinated trades across accounts held in different names, two of which I had never heard of. The scheme had been identified by a compliance officer at the brokerage, rather than reporting it to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which would have meant federal charges, a criminal trial, and the end of Derek's career. In any industry that required a background check, the person on the other end of these emails had chosen a different arrangement. He would not report it in exchange for certain ongoing payments and certain future considerations. His name was Victor Salazar. I sat with that name for a moment. Victor Salazar. I had never heard it before in my life, and yet here it was, woven through 14 months of my son's correspondence like a thread that had been there the whole time, pulling everything slowly in one direction. The payments had started at $8,000 a month. They had increased steadily and without negotiation as the months passed. By February of this year, they had reached $22,000 a month. Derek's emails in response to each increase were increasingly desperate. I could hear his voice in them. That particular pitch he got when he was cornered, the slightly too fast sentences, and the overuse of words like reasonable and understand and surely we can. And Victor Salazar's responses were always the same: calm, brief, final. By May, the total outstanding balance had reached $1.5 million. By July, the emails had stopped being about money at all. I found the one dated the 12th of July, and I read it twice because I could not absorb it fully the first time. Mr. Holt, it read, I am a patient man, but my patience operates within a schedule. Your current balance represents a liability I am no longer willing to carry. You have 48 hours from the timestamp of this message to provide either full payment or a legally binding instrument securing equivalent value in real property. Failure to provide either will result in consequences that I trust you understand without further specification. I do not make this point to frighten you. I make it to be clear. 48 hours or your son disappears. Those were not the exact words, but they were what the words meant, arranged behind the formal language the way a fist is arranged behind a glove. My chest hurt. Not my heart specifically, more like the whole cavity, the entire structure of ribs and sternum, as though someone had reached in and squeezed. I set the phone face down on the drafting table and pressed my palms against my eyes and sat in the red dark behind my hands and breathed. Derek. I thought about the boy who had been afraid of thunderstorms until he was 9 years old and used to come into our room and stand at the foot of the bed until I lifted the covers and let him climb in between us. I thought about his high school graduation, the way he had shaken my hand with great ceremony afterward because he was 18 and felt that handshakes were what men did, and then ruined the whole performance by hugging me anyway. I thought about the summer he was 22, and we had driven up the coast together and argued about baseball for 6 hours and arrived wherever we were going, still arguing and unable to stop laughing about it. And then I thought about $1.5 million and Victor Salazar and the phrase legally binding instrument securing equivalent value in real property. And I understood, with the sick and total comprehension of a man reading a blueprint, he had not designed exactly how this house had become the solution to a problem I had not known existed. I reached into my wallet. I still carried the photograph. It had been there so long the edges had gone soft. The colors faded to the particular palette of photographs from the mid-90s. Derek, at 8 years old, gap-toothed and squinting into the sun, holding up a fish he had caught at the lake near my sister's cabin in Bend. He was grinning so hard his whole face had become the grin, nothing left over for any other expression. I held the photograph for a long time. Then I put it back in my wallet because I could not afford right now to be Derek's father. I needed to be something else, something cooler and more precise. I picked up the phone again and kept reading. The last email in the chain was dated 3 days ago, last Friday. It was not from Victor Salazar. It was from Derek to Evelyn, sent to a personal address. I had not known she had a free webmail account in a name that was not hers. Mom, it read. Salazar moved the deadline up. It's this week now. I told him we'd have the paperwork by Thursday. Please make sure Dad is ready to sign. I can't. And here the sentence ended and then resumed. I can't keep doing this. I need it to be over. I stared at that last line for a long time. I can't keep doing this. I need it to be over. He was not talking about the debt. Or he was not only talking about the debt. I had read enough of my son's emails now to know the particular texture of his desperation, the way it moved through his sentences like water finding cracks. And what I read in those 2 lines was not the greed I had been bracing myself for. It was exhaustion. My son was exhausted. That did not excuse a single thing he had done or was doing. I was clear about that. I held it separate and distinct from the exhaustion and the old photograph and the memory of him climbing into our bed during thunderstorms. Those things existed in their own compartment, and this thing, the emails, the fraud, the plan to take what was mine, existed in another, and I was not going to let the walls between those compartments dissolve, just because dissolving them would be easier. But I noted it. I filed it away. Because when this was over, and I intended for this to be over, I was going to have to figure out what to do with a son who was drowning and had decided that the right response to drowning was to pull his father under with him. The phone buzzed in my hand, a text message, from a number I did not recognize, not saved in any contact. 4 words. Raymond, it's Frank. Call. I looked at the message for a moment. Then I looked up at the ceiling at the ordinary plaster and the ordinary light fixture and the afternoon sun coming through the study window at its ordinary angle. Then I stood up, took my cane, and walked out to the back porch where Evelyn's garden ran along the fence in its neat and tended rows. I called Frank Dalton back. He answered before the first ring had finished. The garden was quiet at that hour, the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows across Evelyn's tomato plants. I stood near the back fence where the signal was strongest and where the kitchen window was not at a useful angle for reading lips, and I pressed the call button. Frank answered before the first ring finished. Raymond. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, from 40 years of friendship, low unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent a career in military law, learning that panic was a resource that spent itself faster than it replenished. Talk to me. So I talked. I told him everything. The bank, Sandra's whisper, the tea in the thermos, the green notebook and the Valentine's Day entry, the camera and the smoke detector, Derek's emails and Victor Salazar, and $1.5 million. I spoke quietly and steadily, and I did not stop until there was nothing left to tell, and when I finished the line was silent for exactly 3 seconds. How long have you known? Frank said. Since Monday night. And you haven't said a word to her? Not one. Another pause. I could hear him breathing, could almost hear him thinking, running the facts through that precise legal mind, the way he had always run everything, sorting, weighing, building toward a conclusion. Raymond, his voice dropped half a register. You did the right thing calling me, but I need you to understand something. What you're describing isn't a family matter anymore. The forged documentation, the controlled substance in the tea, the financial fraud, that's elder abuse under federal statute. It's criminal poisoning. It's wire fraud across state lines. This is a federal case. I know what it is, I said. Do you know what it means for Evelyn? The tomato plants moved slightly in the evening breeze. Evelyn had staked each one individually, tied the stems to the supports with strips of soft cloth so the wire wouldn't cut into them. Yes, I said. I know what it means. Frank exhaled slowly. All right. I'm calling Lena Cruz tonight. She runs the Elder Abuse Unit at Portland Police Bureau, but she has a standing partnership with the FBI Financial Crimes Division when cases cross into wire fraud and extortion. This one does. She'll bring both. I've worked with her before. She's thorough and she's discreet. I need you to get me that thermos. Tomorrow morning, Bixby Park on the east side, she goes to the market on Tuesdays. I'll have 40 minutes. Good. I'll meet you at the lot on the Burnside end. 8:30. A brief pause. Raymond, there's something else. The doctor they're using for the Alzheimer documentation. My hand tightened around the phone. What about him? His name is Warren Pitts. The garden went very still around me, or perhaps the garden was exactly as it had been, and the stillness was only inside me, that particular quality of silence that descends when something confirms what you already feared without knowing you feared it. Warren, I said. The name came out flat, scraped clean of everything. You know him. It was not a question. Frank had always been able to read the shape of what I wasn't saying. 1987, I said. Graduate student. He needed $800 to finish his medical thesis. I gave it to him. I paused. He never paid it back. I never asked. Frank made a sound that was not quite a word, something between recognition and sorrow. He's been fabricating the evaluation records for 6 weeks, Frank said. 3 separate reports, none of them in the hospital system. A nurse at his clinic, Carol Webb, contacted my office this afternoon. She's been uncomfortable with documentation he asked her to countersign. She didn't know what to do with it. I closed my eyes. Behind them, I saw Warren Pitts at 26, thin, nervous, standing in the doorway of my apartment with his hat in his hands. I had not hesitated for a single second. $800. Here, don't worry about it. Now he was building a paper trail designed to prove I had lost my mind. 3 people, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped against something it couldn't get past. My wife, my son, and Warren. I'm sorry, Raymond. Don't be sorry. I opened my eyes. The garden came back, the tomato plants, the long shadows, the ordinary early evening of a Tuesday in August. Be useful. Frank made a sound that might have been a short laugh under different circumstances. 8:30 tomorrow, Burnside lot. I'll be there. I paused. Frank, I need 48 more hours. Can Cruz give me that? I'll ask her, but Raymond. His voice steadied into the tone he used when he needed to be certain he was heard. Keep performing. Whatever they expect from you, give it to them. Don't change a single thing. I looked up at the kitchen window. Through the glass, I could see the edge of the counter, the blue ceramic coffee mug still sitting where I had left it that morning. I've been an architect for 40 years, Frank, I said quietly. I know how to hold a structure together while the cracks spread underneath. Good. A brief pause. Get some sleep. I'll try. I ended the call. I stood in the garden for another moment with the phone in my hand, and the evening settled around me, and 3 names arranged in my chest like 3 load points on a failing beam. Evelyn, Derek, Warren. Then I heard the back door open. Raymond. Evelyn's voice warm and ordinary. Dinner's almost ready. Chicken piccata, your favorite. I put the phone in my pocket, turned around. I looked at my wife standing in the doorway with the kitchen light behind her, and I smiled at her, the way I had smiled at her 10,000 times before. Be right in, I said. She smiled back and went inside. I followed her, and I closed the door behind me, and I did not let my hands shake until I was certain she could no longer see them. I was in the driveway at 8:15. Evelyn was still upstairs. I had heard the shower running when I came downstairs, and I had moved through the kitchen quickly, pouring coffee into a travel mug, pulling on my jacket, retrieving the thermos from the bottom drawer of the drafting table, and wrapping it carefully in a clean dish towel before sliding it into the inside pocket of my coat. 45 years of marriage, and I was sneaking a thermos of poison tea out of my own house like a man robbing himself. The thought sat in my chest, ugly and precise, all the way to Bixby Park. Frank was already there when I pulled in, leaning against the hood of his gray Volvo, with a paper coffee cup in one hand, and the particular expression he wore when he was working, focused slightly remote, already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. He was 68 years old and had the posture of a man 20 years younger, the product of 40 years in military law, where slouching was apparently considered a moral failing. Beside him stood a woman I had not met before. Detective Lena Cruz was 41, compact and precise in a dark blazer with the kind of eyes that registered everything and revealed nothing. She extended her hand when Frank introduced us, and her grip was firm and brief. "Mr. Holt," she said. Frank told me the outline. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this." "I'd rather deal with it than not know about it," I said. Something shifted in her expression, not quite approval, but close to it. She pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves and took the thermos from me with the care of someone who understood exactly what she was handling. "I'm flagging this for emergency priority processing," she said. I'm pulling federal strings-controlled substance in an active elder abuse case goes straight to the FBI forensics lab, not the state Q. I'll have preliminary results within 36 hours. She paused. Don't thank me. Just make sure you're ready when the results come back. She looked up at me. That gets us to tomorrow evening. Tomorrow evening is exactly when I need it, I said. Cruz nodded and sealed the thermos into an evidence bag she produced from her blazer pocket. Frank tells me you're planning to draw them out. Get the admission on record. That's the plan. Then I need you to understand something, Mr. Holt. Her voice was level and direct, the voice of someone who delivered difficult information as a professional courtesy rather than a warning. Once we move completely. There's no partial prosecution here. Everyone in that room when the admission is made, your son included, is on record. My jaw tightened. I understand. She held my gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, making certain, then gave a single nod. 36 hours. Keep your phone on. Sandra Mills had been staring at the same loan document for 20 minutes when her desk phone rang. She knew because she had watched the clock on her computer screen tick from 9:40 to 10:02 without processing a single line of text, her eyes moving over the numbers without transmitting them to any part of her brain that was currently functioning. The document was a routine refinancing application. It required nothing from her except attention, which was the one thing she could not locate this morning. She picked up the phone. This is Sandra. Ms. Mills. The voice was a woman's professional and unhurried. My name is Lena Cruz. I'm a federal investigator. I understand you have information relevant to a case I'm opening this morning. Sandra's hand tightened around the receiver, so hard her knuckles ached. Is he okay? She said. Mr. Holt, is he? He's fine, Cruz said. He's aware and he's cooperating. I need a formal statement from you about what you heard in that parking garage. Can you come to the federal building on Southwest 3rd at noon today? Sandra looked at the refinancing document in front of her. Then she pushed it to the side of her desk. I'll be there at 11:30, she said. Nurse Carol Webb was already in the parking lot of the federal building when Sandra arrived sitting in a blue sedan with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she had stopped drinking 20 minutes ago. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, with the steady, evaluating eyes of someone who had spent a career reading patients' faces for information they weren't volunteering. She had spent 3 weeks trying to convince herself that the documentation Dr. Warren Pitts had asked her to countersign was within the range of acceptable. She had told herself she was misreading the situation. She had told herself it was not her place. She had told herself these things until the morning she looked up Raymond Holt's name in the hospital system and found exactly nothing. No intake records, no evaluation appointments, no imaging orders, no file of any kind. A patient she had been signing documents for did not exist in the system. She got out of the car when she saw Sandra approaching, and the two women looked at each other for a moment, strangers connected by the same thread of information pulling in the same direction. You're here about Raymond Holt, Carol said. It was not a question. Yes, Sandra said. Carol exhaled long and slow, the breath of someone setting down something heavy. Good, she said, because I've been carrying this for 3 weeks and I am done carrying it alone. They went inside together. Cruz called Frank at 4:17 that afternoon. Frank called me 11 minutes later. I was in the study performing uselessness for the camera, turning pages in a project manual I had already read twice, pausing occasionally to look at nothing with the unfocused expression of a man whose thoughts had begun to slip their moorings. I felt the secondary phone vibrate in my pocket and walked to the window, angling my body so my hand retrieving the phone was outside the camera's field of view. Frank's message was 4 words. Lab confirmed, we're ready. I read it twice. Then I put the phone back in my pocket and returned to my chair and turned to another page of the project manual and stared at a materials specification table without seeing it. Tomorrow evening, everything I had built over 65 years would either stand or it wouldn't. I had spent 40 years designing things that needed to appear stronger than they were, retaining walls that looked solid while the drainage system did the actual work. Facades that suggested permanence while the real structure lived behind them, invisible and functional. Every architect learned early that appearance and reality were not the same category, and that knowing the difference was the whole job. This morning, I was the facade. I came downstairs at 9 with my cane and my gray cardigan and the slightly unfocused expression I had been practicing in the bathroom mirror since 6:30 eyes that moved a half second too slowly, a mouth that opened to say something and then didn't, the particular quality of hesitation that belongs to a man whose thoughts have started arriving late to their own party. Evelyn was at the kitchen counter when I came in. She turned and looked at me, and something moved across her face so quickly I almost missed it, a flicker of assessment, clinical and brief there, and gone before the warmth rushed back in to cover it. "Good morning, honey." She crossed to me and took my arm, guiding me toward my chair, with a gentleness that made my back teeth ache. "Did you sleep better last night?" "I think so," I said. I let my voice come out slightly thicker than usual, slightly slower. "I had a dream about the Henderson project. Kept trying to remember the load calculations and couldn't get them right." She made a soft sound and pressed her hand over mine. "You don't need to worry about load calculations anymore, Raymond. You're retired." "I know." I looked down at my coffee mug. "I know that. I couldn't remember, and I kept trying." Her hand tightened over mine for just a moment, not comforting, measuring. I stared at my coffee and did not let my jaw tighten. At 11:15, while I sat in the study turning pages I was not reading, I heard Evelyn's voice from the kitchen, low and quick the way she talked, when she didn't want to be overheard. I leaned forward in my chair and angled my head toward the gap under the study door. "He's showing more signs." A pause. "Yes, Derek, I'm certain. This morning he couldn't remember what project he retired from." Another pause longer. "Tomorrow evening, call Warren and tell him to be here by 4. We'll do the signing after dinner when Raymond is most tired." Her voice dropped even lower. "Just make sure the paperwork is complete. All of it." The call lasted another 40 seconds. I did not hear the rest. I sat back in my chair and pressed my hand flat against the surface of the drafting table and felt the wood grain under my palm, solid, real, certain. And I breathed through the thing that was moving through my chest, which was not quite rage and not quite grief, but lived in the exact territory between them, where a man goes when the two people he loves most in the world are arranging his destruction over a phone call in his own kitchen. On the shelf across the room, Evelyn's photograph looked back at me from its place on the corner of the bookshelf. Oregon Coast, 2019. She was laughing at something I had said, her head tilted back, the gray ocean enormous behind her. I had taken that photograph because I wanted to remember exactly what she looked like when she was happy. When we were happy. Something cracked open in my chest, then not broke, cracked the way old timber cracks under a load. It was never designed to carry a sound more felt than heard. I pressed my hand harder against the drafting table. My eyes burned, and I let them burn because there was no camera angle that could see my face from behind. And for 30 seconds, I let myself be a 65-year-old man who had just heard his wife of 45 years instruct their son to make sure the paperwork was complete. All of it, 30 seconds. Then I straightened my spine, and I picked up the project manual and I turned a page. She brought lunch at 12:30. Tomato soup and half a grilled cheese sandwich, the lunch she had been making for me since the winter of 1987 when I had a bad flu. And she decided that tomato soup and grilled cheese was the correct response to any physical or emotional difficulty. She set the tray on the corner of the drafting table and touched my shoulder. "Eat while it's hot." "Thank you, sweetheart." I looked up at her. Really looked the way I had been carefully not doing since Monday morning. The silver hair, the small lines at the corners of her eyes, the particular set of her mouth that I had once been able to read like a language, and now could not trust to mean what it had always meant. "Evelyn," she looked back at me, and her expression was so perfectly tender that something in my stomach turned over. "What is it, honey?" "Nothing," I said. I'm glad you're here." Her eyes went soft, and she leaned down and pressed her lips to the top of my head, and I sat very still under that kiss, and looked at the bowl of tomato soup, and did not say a single word of what was true. "I'm always here," she said. She went back to the kitchen. I looked at the soup, I picked up the spoon, I put it down again. Then I heard Evelyn's footsteps going upstairs, and I pulled out the secondary phone and typed a message to Frank. "Tomorrow evening confirmed. Warren arriving at 4. Signing after dinner." Frank's response came in under a minute. "Crews will be in position by 3:30. Evelyn booked a mobile notary service for 7. This evening we intercepted the appointment and replaced the notary with Agent Cole, who holds a valid Oregon commission. The original notary has been contacted and will not be coming. Raymond, you're almost through this. I read it twice. Then I put the phone away and picked up my spoon and made myself eat the soup because a man who had forgotten what project he retired from would still eat his lunch. He would eat it slowly with slightly shaking hands, and he would not let himself think too far ahead. I managed the shaking hands without any effort at all. Raymond had discovered everything: the tea, the diary, the camera watching his every move. Now he was about to make the most important decision of his life. Before I show you what he did next, drop the number 65 in the comments to let me know you're still here with me. That number means something in this story. A reminder, some details in this story are fictional shaped to carry a message worth hearing. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, you're welcome to step away. But if you're staying, what comes next will change everything. I found Evelyn in the living room at 2 o'clock, sitting in the armchair by the window with a book open in her lap that she was not reading. She looked up when I came in, and the concern that arranged itself across her face arrived just a fraction of a second too late, not enough for anyone to notice who was not specifically watching for it. I had been watching it. I crossed the room, slowly leaning on my cane more heavily than necessary, and lowered myself onto the sofa across from her, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has to think about sitting down. I looked at my hands in my lap for a moment before I looked up at her. "Evelyn," I said, "I need to talk to you about something." She set the book down immediately, both hands folding in her lap, her full attention on me. "Of course, honey. What is it?" "I've been thinking." I let my voice come out slow and slightly frayed at the edges, the voice of a man working hard to stay on top of a conversation. "About the house. About everything. I forgot the name of the Morrison Street project this morning, the one I spent 3 years on. I couldn't remember it." Her expression moved into something that looked precisely like sorrow. "Raymond?" "No, let me finish." I looked down at my hands again. My left hand was resting on the head of my cane, and I let it tremble slightly, just slightly, the tremor of a man who is frightened and trying not to show it. "I'm scared, Evelyn. I can feel it happening. The edges of things are getting soft. I don't want to. I don't want to become someone who can't take care of what we built. I don't want the house, the accounts, everything we worked for. I don't want it to fall apart because I waited too long." The room was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street. A dog barked twice and stopped. Evelyn rose from the armchair and came to sit beside me on the sofa, and she took both my hands in hers, and her hands were warm and steady, and I focused on a point on the far wall and did not let myself feel what I was feeling. "What are you saying?" she said softly. "Call a lawyer," I said. "Get the paperwork drawn up. I'll sign over power of attorney everything. The house, the accounts, the architectural rights. All of it." I turned to look at her, and I made my eyes do the thing. I had practiced that slight, unfocused quality, that look of a man who is asking to be taken care of. "I trust you, Evelyn. I've always trusted you. Just take care of it. Take care of us." For one full second, she did not move. Then she pulled me into her arms and held me the way she had held me at my mother's funeral and at my father's funeral, and on the night in 2003 when the Morrison Street project nearly collapsed, and we had sat up until 4 in the morning in this same room going over the structural reports together. "I'll take care of everything," she whispered into my shoulder. "I promise." I closed my eyes and let her hold me, and I thought about 45 years, and I thought about phase 3, and I thought, with a precision that surprised even me, about the exact load-bearing capacity of a structure that has been quietly failing from the inside for 8 months. Then I thought about Frank, about crews in position at 3:30 tomorrow, about the small recording device that would be in my shirt pocket by 4 o'clock. "Thank you," I said into her shoulder. My voice came out muffled and genuine and entirely controlled. She pulled back and cupped my face in both hands and looked at me with an expression I had seen 10,000 times and thought I understood and now could not read at all. "I love you," she said. 3 words I had heard from this woman 10,000 times. 3 words that now required translation. "I love you too," I said, and meant it, and hated that I meant it, and could not afford to think about what it meant that I meant it. Derek arrived at 3:45. I heard his car in the driveway from the study and listened to the front door open and Evelyn's voice quick and bright. the particular register she used when she was pleased about something, and trying not to show how pleased she was. Then Derek's voice lower, and the sound of the two of them moving to the kitchen. I gave them 4 minutes. Then I got up from the drafting table and walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there with my cane and my slightly unfocused expression and looked at my son. He was 36 years old and he looked 50. His face had the particular exhausted thinness of a man who had not slept properly in months, and the confidence that had always irritated me, that slightly too loud, slightly too careless quality he'd carried since his mid-20s, was completely gone. What was left underneath it was something I had not seen on his face since he was a boy, and had done something wrong and was waiting to find out if I knew. He looked at me, and something moved across his face that I did not expect. It looked like shame. "Hey, Dad?" His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. "How are you feeling?" "Oh, you know," I waved my free hand vaguely. "Some days are better than others." I looked at him with the soft, slightly distant gaze I had been performing all day. "It's good to see you, son." Something in his jaw tightened. He looked away toward the kitchen window and pressed his lips together. "Yeah," he said. "Good to see you too, Dad." Evelyn moved between us with the practiced ease of a woman managing a room. "Derek is going to help us with the paperwork, honey, just to make sure everything is in order." She touched my arm. "Why don't you rest before dinner? Warren will be here around 4, and then we can take care of everything after we eat." "All right," I said. "That sounds fine." I turned and walked back toward the study. At the hallway, I stopped as though I had forgotten something, and looked back at them both standing in the kitchen. Derek was staring at the floor. Evelyn was watching me with a smile that did not waver. "Evelyn," I said, "what are we having for dinner?" "Pot roast," she said. "Your favorite." "Lovely," I said. I went back to the study and closed the door, and stood on the other side of it with my hand pressed flat against the wood and my eyes closed and my heart slamming against my ribs with a force that had nothing to do with the performance and everything to do with the fact that my son had looked at me with shame on his face and looked away, and I did not know yet what to do with the particular kind of pain that came attached to that. I pulled out the secondary phone, typed to Frank, "Derek is here. Everything is moving. Tomorrow is on." Then I sat down at the drafting table and said quietly to the empty room, to the camera blinking in the smoke detector above me, to no one at all, "Come on then, show me who you really are." The doorbell rang at 4:03. I was in the study turned toward the door when I heard it. Evelyn's footsteps crossed the foyer. The front door opened. A man's voice, low and professionally warm, said something I could not make out. Evelyn laughed that particular laugh she used for guests, slightly higher than her real laugh, slightly more musical. I stood up from the drafting table. I had been preparing for this moment since Frank had said the name 2 nights ago in Evelyn's garden. I had been preparing for it the way you prepare for a structural inspection on a building you designed yourself, knowing every corner, every load, point, every place where the material might show stress, knowing also that the inspector does not know what you know, and that this asymmetry is either your greatest advantage or your greatest vulnerability, depending on how you use it. I picked up my cane, I straightened my cardigan, I arranged my face into the expression I had been wearing all day, and I walked out to meet Warren Pitts for the first time in 22 years. He was standing in the foyer with his coat over one arm and a leather medical bag in his other hand, and he was heavier than I remembered, broader across the shoulders, with silver at his temples, and the particular confidence of a man who had spent 30 years being deferred to in rooms full of frightened people. He looked exactly like what he was, a successful physician in his mid-50s, someone whose authority was so habitual he had probably stopped noticing it. He looked at me, and I watched something happen behind his eyes. It was not guilt exactly, it was the thing that lives next to guilt in the moments before it becomes too large to manage a flinching, a rapid recalibration, a look that wanted to go somewhere else and could not find an acceptable destination. His jaw moved slightly like a man swallowing something that had gone down wrong. "Raymond," he extended his hand. His voice came out steady. I gave him credit for that. "It's been a long time." "Warren," I took his hand. His grip was firm and brief, and he released it quickly. "It has." He looked at me for exactly 1 second, and then his gaze moved to Evelyn, and the relief on his face when it landed somewhere safe was visible enough that I could have drawn it. "Shall we?" Evelyn said, gesturing toward the study. He set his medical bag on the corner of the drafting table and began unpacking it with the practiced efficiency of a man running through a routine. Blood pressure cuff, small pen light, A laminated card with rows of words and images I recognized as a standard cognitive assessment tool, the kind used to evaluate memory orientation and executive function. I sat in my chair and let him work. He checked my blood pressure 118/74, which would have told a competent physician that I was in excellent cardiovascular health for my age, but Warren wrote it down without comment. He asked me to follow the pen light with my eyes. He asked me what day it was, and I said Thursday, which was wrong by 1 day, and I watched him write it down. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, and I stopped at 79 and said I had lost the thread, and he wrote that down too. He asked me to name the current president. I named the wrong one. Through all of it, he did not look at my face. He looked at his notepad, at the cognitive assessment card, at the blood pressure readout on the portable monitor. He looked at every surface in the room except the one that held my eyes. I knew why. In 1987, Warren Pitts had been 26 years old and desperate in the way that only graduate students 3 months from completing 8 years of work can be desperate, total consuming, slightly unhinged. He had knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening, and I had opened it, and he had stood there with the particular posture of a man who has never asked for help before and has no idea how to do it gracefully. "Ray," he had said, "I need $800 or I can't submit my thesis." I had not asked what it was for. I had not asked when he would pay it back. I had gone to my desk, written a check, and handed it to him. And when he started to explain, I had said, "Warren, stop. Pay me back when you can." He never had. I had never mentioned it. 38 years later, he was sitting at my drafting table, writing down that I had named the wrong president and lost count at 79, and the hand that held the pen was not entirely steady. I watched that hand and I felt something that was not quite sympathy and not quite contempt, but lived in the complicated territory between them, the feeling you get when someone you once helped freely and without condition has made choices you cannot defend and cannot entirely condemn, because you do not know what pressures shape them and you are tired and grief has made everything heavy and you cannot afford to feel this right now, but you feel it anyway. "Mr. Holt." Warren's voice broke into my thoughts. He was looking at his notepad, still not at me. "I'm going to ask you to sign your name here and then write today's date beside it." He slid the notepad across the drafting table toward me. I picked up the pen. In 1987, I had picked up a pen and written a check for $800 without hesitating for a single second. The man I had been at 27 had not needed to think about it. I looked at the signature line on Warren's evaluation form, Raymond Holt, date. I wrote my name slowly with the slight shakiness of a man whose fine motor control was compromised, and I wrote the wrong date beside it one day, off consistent with the wrong day I had given him earlier, and I slid the notepad back. Warren looked at the signature. Then he picked up the pen and began filling in the section of the form that described his clinical findings. His handwriting was small and precise and completely illegible from where I was sitting, but I could see from the length of what he wrote that it was thorough. Alzheimer's disease moderate to severe stage. Insufficient cognitive capacity for independent management of financial or legal affairs. Recommendation for immediate appointment of legal guardian. I did not know exactly what he was writing, but I knew. When he finished, he capped his pen. He began repacking his medical bag with the same practiced efficiency he had unpacked it. He did not look at me. At the door of the study, he paused, and for the first time since he had walked into my house, Warren Pitts looked directly at my face. His eyes were red at the edges. His jaw was working. He looked like a man standing at the bottom of something very deep, looking up at the distance between where he was and where he had intended to be, and understanding for the first time exactly how far that distance was. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He walked out of the study and pulled the door shut behind him, and I sat at my drafting table in the yellow lamplight and listened to his footsteps cross the foyer and the front door open and close, and I pressed both palms flat against the drafting table surface and breathed. The pen he had left behind was still on the corner of the table. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked up at the smoke detector above me at the small, blinking light, and I thought about $800 and 38 years and the extraordinary distances a person can travel from who they intended to be. "Tonight," I said to the empty room. One word. All I needed. Dinner was pot roast. Evelyn had made it the same way she always made it, carrots and potatoes, and the good rosemary from the garden, slow-cooked until the meat fell apart without being asked. She set the table with the cloth napkins and the ceramic plates, and she poured water into the good glasses, and the three of us sat down together in the dining room, like a family having an ordinary Wednesday evening meal. Derek sat across from me and moved his food around his plate without eating much of it. He had changed into a cleaner shirt since the afternoon, which told me he had gone home and come back, which meant he had made a choice to return. He had chosen to be here tonight. I held that fact and did not know what to do with it. "You're not eating," I said to him. He looked up. His eyes were raw at the edges, the look of a man who had been running on insufficient sleep for longer than was sustainable. "Not that hungry," he said. "Long day." "Eat something," I said. "You look thin." Something moved across his face, a flinching brief and real, and he picked up his fork and took a bite of the potato, and chewed it without tasting it. Evelyn watched us both from the head of the table, with an expression of careful warmth, conducting the scene the way she had always conducted difficult family moments, smoothing the edges, filling the silences, keeping everything moving forward. She was very good at it. I had always admired that about her. At 7:15, Evelyn cleared the plates, and Derek disappeared briefly to the front porch, and I sat at the dining table with my hands wrapped around a glass of water, and looked at the room around me. The painting on the far wall that we had bought at a street market in Ashland in 1998. The sideboard my mother had left me. The window that looked out onto the front yard where the oak tree was going, gold at the edges in the August evening light. I had designed this room to feel like the center of something, warm and grounded and permanent. At 7:30, Evelyn touched my shoulder. "Raymond, are you ready?" "Yes," I said. "I think so." The study felt smaller with 4 people in it. Evelyn stood near the bookshelf. Derek stood by the door with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders pulled in the posture of a man who wanted to take up as little space as possible. The man who had arrived 10 minutes ago and introduced himself as Cole, a notary. Public sent by the attorney's office stood near the window with a leather portfolio under one arm, compact, unremarkable, the kind of face that did not insist on being remembered. I knew what Agent Cole was. He knew that I knew. We had exchanged exactly one look when he came through the front door, a glance of perhaps 2 seconds that contained everything necessary and nothing else. The documents were spread across my drafting table. I could see my name printed at the top of the first page, Raymond Arthur Holt. Below it, the legal language of a full power of attorney transfer the house, the bank accounts, the architectural rights, the investment portfolio, all of it flowing in one direction away from me. Evelyn stood at my shoulder. "Take your time, honey." Derek was looking at the floor. I pulled the chair out from the drafting table and sat down. The leather of the chair, worn smooth in exactly the shape of me after 30 years of use, settled around me like something familiar and certain. I looked at the documents in front of me. I picked up the pen that Agent Cole had placed at the top right corner of the first page. The room held its breath. I looked at the signature line. Then I looked up at the architectural drawings on the wall in front of me, the elevation plans for this house drawn in my own hand. In 1991, every line exactly as I had intended it. The roof line, the foundation depth, the load calculations penciled in the margins and numbers so small you had to lean close to read them. 30 years this house had stood. Every storm, every winter, every ordinary Tuesday. I looked at the pen in my hand. Then I set it down on the table. The sound it made was very small, a soft click of metal against wood. But in the silence of the room, it landed like something much larger, and I felt rather than saw Evelyn go still beside me. "Raymond." Her voice was careful, measured. I did not answer her immediately. I looked at the documents in front of me at my name printed at the top, and I let the silence in the room do what silence does when no one moves, to fill it, expand and thicken and make itself known. Then I looked up. I looked at Derek first. He had lifted his head from the floor and was watching me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was 12 years old, and had broken the living room window with a baseball and was waiting to find out how much trouble he was in. The expression of a boy who knows that something is coming and cannot calculate its shape. Then I looked at Evelyn. She was standing very straight. Her hands were clasped in front of her, the knuckles just slightly pale. The warmth in her face was still there, but it had gone careful the way a flame goes careful in a wind. Then I looked at Agent Cole, who had not moved from his position by the window and whose face revealed nothing at all, and I took a slow breath. "Before I sign anything," I said, and my voice came out low and level and entirely unlike the voice I had been performing for 3 days. I have a few questions. The color left Evelyn's face so completely and so quickly that I watched it happen, the warmth draining out like water from a basin, leaving something underneath that I had not seen before. Derek made a sound, not a word, just a sound low and involuntary, the sound a person makes when something lands that they have been dreading. Agent Cole's right hand moved very slightly toward the inside of his jacket. The room that I had designed to feel like the center of something held all 4 of us in its careful light, and nobody moved, and the pen lay on the drafting table where I had set it, and I looked at my wife of 45 years, across the distance of everything that had happened and everything that was about to, and I held her gaze and did not look away. "A few questions," I said again. "That's all." Raymond had set down the pen. The room was frozen. Evelyn, Derek, the documents, everything was in that one room, waiting. Before I reveal what Raymond said next and what Evelyn finally admitted out loud, comment truth below. So I know you're still here, because what happens in the next few minutes is something none of them will ever be able to take back. This story contains fictional elements crafted to bring its message to life. Names, places, and details are not drawn from any specific person if you'd prefer to step away. Now that's completely okay. But the truth Raymond is about to speak, that part I believe is universal. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and placed 3 things on the drafting table: the steel thermos, the green notebook, and a folded sheet of paper that Frank had printed from the laboratory report and slipped to me that morning at Bixby Park, tucked inside the dish towel I had used to wrap the thermos. I set them down in a row, evenly spaced the way you lay out evidence on a table when you want the evidence to do the talking first. Then I looked up at the smoke detector above my drafting table. "The camera in that housing," I said, looking up at the smoke detector above the drafting table, "has been running, but everything it recorded after Monday was sent directly to Detective Cruz's server, not yours. I redirected the feed the morning after I found it." I watched Derek's eyes go to the ceiling. Everything you believed it recorded after Monday, it recorded nothing. Evelyn's breath caught, just slightly, just enough. "This thermos," I said, placing my hand on it, "contains the chamomile tea you brought me Monday evening, Evelyn. I poured it in, rather than drinking it." I slid the laboratory report across the table toward her. "The state lab confirmed lorazepam in the sample 36 hours ago, enough to cause significant cognitive disorientation after 2 weeks of daily use." I looked at her steadily. "A Schedule 4 controlled substance, administered without consent. That's criminal poisoning under Oregon statute." Evelyn's hand went to the edge of the drafting table. Her fingers gripped it. "And this," I said, opening the green notebook to the page I had marked, "is your handwriting, Evelyn. In the shorthand we invented together in 1981, because you wanted to pass notes at faculty parties without anyone reading them." I turned it to face her. "You forgot that I remember every symbol." The page with the Valentine's Day entry faced up at her. Phase 3. Signature by Friday. Derek made a sound like the air had gone out of him. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, and his eyes filled so fast I could see it happen, the shine spreading before he could stop it. And he turned his face toward the window, and his shoulders began to shake with the effort of holding something in that was too large to hold. "Dad," he said. The word came out broken in the middle. "Dad, Not yet," I said quietly. "Let me finish." I looked at Evelyn. She had not moved. She was gripping the edge of the drafting table with both hands now, her knuckles white as the document paper beneath them, and the warmth that had lived in her face for 45 years. That particular quality of light that I had loved and relied on and built my life around was gone. What was underneath it was something I had never seen before. Not cold, not cruel, terrified. "Evelyn," I said. Her name felt different in my mouth now. Heavier. "How long?" Her jaw worked. Her eyes were bright and dangerous, with something that was not tears, but lived in the same place tears come from. 8 months, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. 8 months, I repeated. And then something broke in her. Not slowly. All at once, the way a load-bearing wall goes, when the pressure finally exceeds the tolerance, not a crumbling, but a collapse, sudden and total. Her voice came up from somewhere low and raw and furious, and she straightened away from the table, and her eyes went fierce and wet. "What do you know about it?" Her voice cracked on the last word and kept going. Victor was going to kill him, Raymond. Kill him, our son. She pressed her fist against her sternum like she was trying to hold something in her chest in place. I called every bank. I called every lawyer. There was nothing. And Derek kept telling me it was going to be fine, and it was not fine, and I could not watch him. Her voice broke completely, and she pulled it back together with visible effort, her whole body shaking with the force of it. I could not watch my son disappear. I could not do it. So I did the only thing I could find to do. The room held her words. Derek had turned back from the window. Tears were running freely down his face now, and he was not trying to stop them. "Mom," he said. "Mom, stop." I would do it again. Her voice dropped to something flat and certain and devastating. "I would do it again, Raymond. That's your son. That is your son." I looked at this woman, my wife, the person who had known me longer and more completely than anyone alive, and I felt the grief of it move through me like a current, not sharp, not hot, but deep and thorough and permanent, the kind that does not pass but becomes part of the foundation. "I know he's my son," I said, "and I know you love him, but Evelyn," I held her gaze, "you were going to take everything I built, everything I am, and you were going to do it while I was still alive to lose it." Her face crumpled. "I know," she whispered. "Raymond, I know." I reached down and pressed the button on the side of my watch. From the hallway I heard footsteps. The door opened the way doors open in dreams, without a knock, without warning, simply open, and then Detective Cruz was standing in the frame with 2 federal agents behind her and the hallway light falling past them into the study. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She stepped into the room the way a person steps into a space they have already accounted for, taking in all 4 corners in a single sweep. And when her eyes settled on the room, she gave one small nod to me or to the situation or to both. "Mr. Holt," her voice was level and professional. "Everything in this room from the past 22 minutes has been transmitted and recorded as federal evidence." She reached into her jacket and produced a document that she set on the edge of the drafting table without ceremony. "Mrs. Holt, Mr. Derek Holt, you're both under arrest for elder financial abuse, criminal conspiracy, and administration of a controlled substance without consent." Derek's legs went out from under him. Not dramatically, not like the movies. His knees simply stopped working, and he went down into the chair behind him and sat there with both hands pressed flat on his thighs and his head bowed forward and his whole body shaking with the particular violence of a man who has been holding something enormous for too long and has finally completely run out of the strength to hold it. "Dad," his voice came out in pieces. "Dad, I need you to know that He stopped, started again. "I know there's nothing I can say right now. I know that. But I need you to know that I knew it was wrong. Every single day I knew it was wrong." I looked at my son sitting broken in the chair, and I felt the grief of it in my back teeth and my knuckles, in the specific weight of my cane in my hand. "I know you knew," I said. "That's the part that will take the longest." One of the federal agents moved toward Derek. Derek stood without being asked, straightening himself by sheer effort of will, and he extended his wrists, and he did not look up. Agent Cole stepped quietly to the side of the room. His role was finished. He folded his hands in front of him and looked at the middle distance with the practiced neutrality of someone who has witnessed this particular human moment more times than he can count. Then the second agent moved toward Evelyn. She did not make it easy or difficult. She stood exactly where she had been standing since the door opened, her hands still at her sides, her chin level. The agent approached her from the left, and she turned her wrists outward slightly, an almost imperceptible movement, the gesture of a woman making an accommodation she had already made in her mind before it was asked of her. The handcuffs made a sound, small and metallic and final. I had designed structures intended to last a century. I had calculated tolerances and stress points and the precise moment at which a material would cease to perform its function. I had never calculated for this sound. I had never run the numbers on what it would cost to hear it applied to the wrists of the woman who had kissed the top of my head at lunch. Evelyn looked at me, not with anger, not with the fury that had broken through her 20 minutes ago, not with the terror I had seen underneath the warmth when the warmth finally went. She looked at me with something quieter and more permanent, a look that had been there a long time, I realized underneath everything else, waiting for a moment, clear enough to be visible. She was still my wife. That was what the look said. Everything else was true, and this was also true, and she did not know what to do with both of those things being true simultaneously. And neither did I. And we were 65 and 62 years old, and standing in the study of the house I had built for us, and there were handcuffs on her wrists. The agent began to guide her toward the door. She took 3 steps and stopped. The agent paused beside her. Cruz watched from the doorway. Nobody spoke. Evelyn turned and looked back at me over her shoulder. Her eyes were dry. Her face was composed. She looked like she had looked on our wedding day before the ceremony began, gathered into herself, present clear. "Raymond," she said. One word. My name. The same word she had said 10,000 times in 10,000 different registers, called up the stairs. Whispered in the dark, said across a dinner table with exasperation and warmth, and 45 years of accumulated meaning. I held her gaze. My throat had closed completely and I did not trust my voice, so I did the only thing available to me. I nodded, once, slowly. Something in her face shifted, not relief, not absolution, but something that acknowledged the nod and held it and did not look away until the agent touched her arm gently and she turned and walked out of the study. And I listened to her footsteps cross the foyer and the front door open, and I did not follow. The room emptied in stages. Derek, the federal agents. Cruz paused at the door and looked back at me. "We'll need your formal statement tomorrow," she said. "Frank will be with you." A pause. "You did well, Mr. Holt." I didn't answer. She left, and I heard the front door close for the last time, and the house settled into a silence I had not heard before. Not the silence of a house at rest, but the silence of a house recalibrating, learning what it was now that certain things had changed. I stood in the middle of my study with my hand on my cane, and I looked at the 3 objects still arranged on the drafting table: the thermos, the green notebook, the laboratory report. I had placed them there to tell the truth, and they had told it, and now they sat in the aftermath of their own purpose, quiet and spent. Frank appeared in the doorway. He had been in the hallway during the arrest, far enough back to be out of the way, close enough to be present. He was 68 years old, and he looked at tonight in a way he usually didn't, the lines in his face deeper in the study lamplight. He crossed the room and put his hand on my shoulder without saying anything. I put my hand over his. We stood like that for a moment, 2 old men in a study at the end of an extraordinary Wednesday, holding the weight of it between us. "Frank," I said finally. My voice came out rougher than I expected, scraped against something it couldn't get clear of. "I know," he said. That was enough. The kitchen felt wrong without her in it. Not empty in the way a room feels empty when no one is there. Empty in the specific way a room feels when the person who gave it its particular quality of warmth has been removed from it. The coffee maker sat where it always sat. The blue ceramic mug sat where it always sat. The rosemary plant on the windowsill that Evelyn had been tending since the spring leaned slightly toward the morning light, the way it always did. Everything in its place, everything wrong. Frank had stayed the night in the guest room without being asked and without making a thing of it, which was exactly what 40 years of friendship looked like in practice. He came downstairs at 7:15 in yesterday's shirt with his hair uncombed and poured himself coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table, and we drank in the particular silence of 2 people who have said everything necessary and have arrived together at the place on the other side of words. "You should eat something," he said eventually. "Probably," I said. Neither of us moved. Outside the kitchen window, the oak tree held its leaves in the still morning air. A bird landed on the feeder I had built 2 winters ago, the crooked one with the uneven base, and pecked at it with complete indifference to anything happening inside the house. "I met her at a construction site," I said. Frank looked up from his coffee. 1979. I was 22 years old, and I had a summer contract surveying a commercial site on Burnside. She was bringing lunch to her uncle who ran the crew. I turned the mug in my hands. She stepped on my survey stakes, 3 of them, just walked right through them without looking down. I was furious. I paused. She looked up and laughed and said she was sorry, and I forgot every single thing I had been planning to say. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was a remarkable woman, Raymond." "She still is," I said. "That's the complicated part." My phone rang at 9:40. Sandra Mills. I answered it before the second ring. "Mr. Holt." Her voice was careful and warm, the voice of someone choosing words with both hands. "I wanted to call, to make sure you were—" "I wanted to call." I'm all right, Sandra, I said. Thank you for what you did. A breath on the other end, shaky at the edges. I almost didn't, she said. I want you to know that. I stood at that window for 10 seconds after you walked in, and I almost decided it wasn't my place. What changed your mind? The pause that followed was long enough that I thought the line might have dropped. My grandmother, she said finally. Her name was Ruth. She lived alone in Gresham for 20 years after my grandfather died. Sharp as anyone I've ever known, read 3 books a week, did the crossword every morning in pen. Her voice tightened. Her nephew decided she couldn't manage her own affairs. Filed the paperwork, got himself appointed guardian, moved her into a facility in Beaverton that she hated. A breath. She died 14 months later. The death certificate said natural causes. Another breath slower. I was 24. I sat at her funeral and I promised myself that if I ever saw it happening to someone else, I would not look away. My throat tightened so completely I had to wait a moment before I could speak. Ruth would be proud of you, I said. I'm certain of that. Sandra made a sound that was almost a laugh, and almost something else entirely. Detective Cruz said my formal statement is on record. She said it's strong. It is, I said. You gave me time, Sandra. That's what I needed most. After we hung up, Frank refilled both our mugs without being asked and sat back down and looked at me across the table. Good woman, he said. Extraordinary woman, I said. The phone buzzed against the table. Unknown number. A text message, 4 lines, no punctuation, no greeting. Mr. Holt, this is Victor Salazar. Your son owes me a significant debt. His current situation does not cancel that obligation. I think we should meet and discuss arrangements. I am available today. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face up on the table between Frank and me and let him read it. Frank read it, set his coffee mug down, looked at me. How many more? I said. Frank picked up his own phone and began dialing Cruz. 1 more, he said. Just 1. The coffee shop on Southwest Morrison was the kind of place that had been there since before the neighborhood. Changed dark wood, narrow windows, the smell of old espresso ground into the walls over decades of ordinary mornings. I arrived 12 minutes early and chose a table near the center of the room, away from the walls where anyone entering could see me immediately and where I could see the door. Frank was at the corner table with a newspaper and a cappuccino, his reading glasses on, looking precisely like a retired man with nowhere to be. Cruz was at the counter, her back to the room, in civilian clothes, her badge and her arrest warrant, both exactly where they needed to be. I ordered black coffee and waited. Victor Salazar walked in at 2 o'clock exactly. He was not what I had pictured from his emails. I had pictured someone harder, something more obviously dangerous. What came through the door instead was a man in his mid-40s in a well-cut charcoal suit, hair going gray at the temples, with the kind of face that belonged in a boardroom, composed, intelligent, accustomed to being the most patient person in any room he entered. He looked at me across the coffee shop and walked to my table without hurrying, and sat down across from me, and placed his phone face down on the table between us. Mr. Holt, his voice was smooth and unhurried. Thank you for coming. I almost didn't, I said. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. I understand you've had a difficult few days. I have, I said. My wife was arrested last night, my son as well. Yes. He folded his hands on the table. Which is precisely why I thought we should talk. Derek's situation with the law is unfortunate, but his financial obligations to me exist independently of his legal situation. You understand that. I understand that you believe that, I said. Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration. He looked at me the way a man looks at a chess piece that has moved unexpectedly. Mr. Holt, he said, his voice dropping half a register. Derek owes me $1.5 million. The collateral he offered your property, your architectural rights, was never formally transferred, which means the debt is still outstanding. He leaned forward slightly. I'm prepared to consider the matter settled if you sign over the architectural rights to the house. A clean transaction. No further involvement with your family. And if I don't, he held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Derek is currently in a very vulnerable position. Jails can be difficult environments. I have associates who can make that experience significantly more difficult. He said it the way a man orders coffee simply without effect, as a statement of available options, or significantly less difficult depending on the choices made here today. There it was, clear and unambiguous and exactly what Cruz needed. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed the recording device on the table between us. It was small, a flat rectangle no larger than a matchbook, and it had been running since I sat down. Victor looked at it. Then he looked at me. Something happened in his face in that moment that I had not expected, not panic, not the collapse of confidence, but something quieter and more revealing, a weariness. The expression of a man who has played this particular game in this particular way for long enough that even losing it feels familiar. "You recorded that," he said. "Every word," I said, "since you walked in the door." He straightened in his chair, his hands unfolded on the table, and lay flat very still. He looked at the recording device, and then at the window, and then at some middle point between the two, and I watched him do the mathematics. Cruz appeared at his left shoulder. She moved with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have made arrests in public spaces enough times to know that speed and calm are not opposites. Her badge was in her left hand, and her voice was level. "Victor Salazar, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're under arrest for extortion and criminal threatening. Please stand up slowly." Victor stood. He did not resist. He did not speak. He looked at me one more time across the small table with its 2 coffee cups and its recording device. And in that look was something I had not expected to find there, something almost like recognition. One man acknowledging another across the distance of a very different set of choices. Then he looked away and put his hands behind his back. As Cruz guided him toward the door, a man in a dark overcoat who had been sitting near the entrance stood up and moved to intercept them. He was 40, sharp-faced, carrying a leather briefcase. "Detective Cruz." His voice cut through the coffee shop with the particular confidence of a man who is paid very well to be confident in difficult rooms. "I'm Bradley Keene, counsel for Mr. Salazar. I'd like a moment with my client before—" "You can speak with your client at the Federal Building, Mr. Keene," Cruz said without slowing. Keene stepped to the side. He looked at me. "Mr. Holt," he said. "My client has extensive documentation regarding your son's financial activities that may be of significant interest to federal prosecutors. I think you'll find that a conversation about cooperation might benefit everyone involved." He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "Including Derek?" I looked at Bradley Keene and his leather briefcase and his sharp face, and I thought about Derek sitting broken in that chair last night, saying I knew it was wrong every single day, and I thought about what cooperation meant in the language this man was speaking, which was leverage, which was the same currency Victor Salazar had been trading in all along. "Talk to Detective Cruz," I said. "I'm done making decisions for my son." I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold while we talked. I drank it anyway, and I looked out the narrow window at the ordinary afternoon on Southwest Morrison Street, and I felt for the first time in 5 days something that was not grief or fury or the cold weight of betrayal, something quieter, something that might eventually become its own kind of foundation. The visitation room at Multnomah County Detention Center smelled of disinfectant and recycled air, and the particular staleness of a space that never sees direct sunlight. I had driven there alone. Frank had offered to come, and I had told him no, and he had understood, because 40 years of friendship had taught him the difference between the moments when I needed company and the moments when I needed to do something by myself in order to know that I could. The guard at the desk had checked my identification and given me a locker for my cane policy, he said apologetically, and I had walked the corridor to the visitation area with my right hand trailing along the wall for balance, which was not something I would normally have done, and which I allowed myself because no one here knew what I would normally do. I sat down at the booth and waited. Derek came through the door on the other side of the glass 2 minutes later. He had lost weight in 2 weeks that a man his age should not be able to lose in 2 weeks. His face had gone angular in a way that reminded me of photographs of his grandfather, my father, in the years after the war. That particular thinness that comes not from not eating, but from the body consuming something internal that was not meant to be consumed. He was wearing the facility clothes, gray and formless, and he moved to the seat across from me with the careful deliberateness of a man relearning how to occupy space. He sat down. He looked at me through the glass. His eyes filled immediately, not spilling over, just filling the shine spreading across them before he could organize any defense against it, and he pressed his lips together hard and looked at the surface of the counter between us, and breathed. "Dad!" he said. His voice came out wrecked, stripped of every layer he had spent 36 years building on top of the original thing. "Why did you come Because you're my son, I said. That doesn't change what you did, but it doesn't change that either. He made a sound that was not quite a word. His jaw worked. He pressed his fist against his mouth for a moment, and then lowered it and looked up at me, and his eyes were so red and so raw that I had to remind myself to keep my own face steady. I tried to tell you, he said. 6 months ago, I drove to the house and I sat outside in the car for 40 minutes and I couldn't. He stopped, swallowed. Mom called me while I was sitting there. She knew somehow. She always knew. His voice dropped. She said you would never forgive me. She said it was better if you didn't know, that she would handle it. He shook his head slowly, the movement of a man who has run the same calculation too many times and keeps arriving at the same answer. I let her convince me. I told myself it was because I believed her. But the truth is I let her convince me because it was easier than sitting across from you and saying what I'm saying right now. I looked at my son through the scratched plexiglass of a county jail visitation booth, and I thought about Evelyn in the kitchen saying she would handle it, and I thought about what it meant to love someone so completely that you removed every difficult thing from their path, including the things that were difficult because they were necessary. Your mother was trying to protect you, I said. I know. His voice cracked on the second word. That's the worst part. I know exactly why she did every single thing she did, and it doesn't make any of it okay, and I don't know what to do with both of those things being true at the same time. You hold them both, I said. That's all. You don't resolve them. You just hold them, and you keep moving. Derek looked at me for a long moment. His chin was trembling. He pressed his lips together again hard, and the effort of it was visible in the cords of his neck, and the set of his jaw, and the way his hands on the counter had gone white at the knuckles. Are you going to be okay? He asked. In the house, by yourself. The question surprised me. Not its content. I had asked myself the same question every morning for 2 weeks, but that he was asking it. That in the middle of everything in a jail visitation room, in gray facility clothes, having lost 10 pounds, he couldn't spare his first substantial question to me, was about whether I was going to be okay. Yes, I said. I have Frank, I have Sandra, I have the house. I paused. I have you, whatever shape that takes going forward. His face crumpled then, fully completely, the way faces crumple when the last organizing structure gives way, and he brought both hands up and pressed them over his eyes, and his shoulders shook with the force of what moved through him. And I sat on my side of the glass, and I let him, because there was nothing else to do, and because some things need to be felt completely before they can be survived. After a while, the shaking slowed. He lowered his hands. His face was wet and blotched and completely undefended, and he looked more like the boy I had known than he had looked in 15 years. Dad, he said, is she okay? Is she... I don't know yet, I said honestly. I haven't been to see her. He nodded, absorbed that. Will you... he asked. Eventually, I looked at my son through the glass. I don't know, I said. And then because it was true, and because he deserved the truth more than he deserved comfort, I want to. That's where I am right now. I want to. Derek nodded again slowly, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but the thing adjacent to relief. The thing that exists when the worst possible answer does not arrive, and you realize you had been bracing for it without knowing. The guard appeared at the door behind Derek. 2 minutes. Derek looked at me. Thank you for coming, he said. I didn't expect... He stopped. I didn't expect you to come. I know, I said. That's something we're going to have to work on. The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Something that remembered what a smile felt like and was working its way back toward it from a significant distance. Yeah, he said quietly. Okay, Dad. The guard touched his shoulder, and Derek stood and he looked at me through the glass for one more moment, with everything unresolved and everything still present, and nothing fixed and the faintest imaginable suggestion of something that might in time become the beginning of something else. Then he turned and walked back through the door. I sat in the empty booth for a moment, the recycled air, the disinfectant smell, my hand flat on the counter where his hands had been. Then I got up and went to get my cane and walked back out into the August afternoon, and the sunlight hit me like something I had forgotten was available, and I stood on the sidewalk outside Multnomah County Detention Center and breathed it in. November came to Portland the way it always did, without announcement, the light going flat and gray overnight, the oak tree in the front yard finally releasing the last of its leaves in a single wet week that left the sidewalk copper and dark. I had been in this house alone for 3 months. I had learned the particular weight of it, the way silence distributes itself differently through rooms, when there is only one person to absorb it, the way you stop leaving the radio on, and then start again, and then stop again, until you find the setting that is honest rather than compensatory. I had learned to cook for one, which mostly meant I did not cook, and Frank came over on Tuesdays with food from the Italian place on Thurman Street, and we ate at the kitchen table and talked about everything except the things we did not need to talk about anymore, because they were already understood. The courtroom on the 4th floor of the Marco Hatfield United States Courthouse was wood-paneled and high-ceilinged and entirely serious about itself. The way federal courtrooms are serious, not pompous, just certain of their function. I sat in the second row. Sandra Mills took the stand first. She sat up straight and looked at the prosecutor and told the story clearly. The parking garage, Derek's voice, the name of the drug, the asset delegation, paperwork on her desk. The next morning, Raymond Holt's name at the top. When the defense attorney attempted to suggest she might have misheard, Sandra looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who has been waiting 3 months for this moment, and her chin lifted slightly. "I did not mishear," she said. "I remember every word." The defense attorney sat down. I looked at Sandra on that stand. This young woman who had made a decision at a bank window on a Monday morning that she did not have to make, who had kept a promise to a grandmother she had lost too soon, and I felt something move through me that was not grief and not gratitude exactly, but lived in the space between them, warm and permanent. Nurse Carol Webb followed. She described the 3 evaluation forms Dr. Pitts had asked her to countersign over 6 weeks. She described searching Raymond Holt's name in the hospital system and finding nothing, no intake records, no evaluation appointments, no imaging orders, no file of any kind. Her voice was steady throughout the voice of a woman who had carried something uncomfortable for a long time and had finally set it down in the right place. When the prosecutor asked how she felt when she found no records, Carol looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "Sick," she said. "I felt sick." 2 words. The courtroom held them without reaction, the way rooms hold things that need no elaboration. Dr. Warren Pitts took the stand under his cooperation agreement. He had lost weight since August. His face had gone narrower, the lines deeper around his mouth. His voice was quiet and precise, and he answered every question directly without elaboration, in the manner of a man who has decided that the only thing left available to him is accuracy. When he confirmed that he had fabricated all 3 evaluation reports, that Raymond Holt had never been evaluated, never been diagnosed, never set foot in his clinic, the courtroom absorbed the information the way it had absorbed Carol's 2 words, without drama, with the particular weight of things that are simply true. I did not look at Warren when he testified. I looked at my hands in my lap, and I thought about $800 and a Tuesday evening in 1987 and a young man standing in my doorway who did not know how to ask for help. I thought about 38 years and the extraordinary distances a person can travel from who they intended to be. I let it be what it was. I did not try to make it simpler or heavier than that. Evelyn sat at the defense table in a gray jacket I had never seen before. Her hair was shorter, her face was thinner. She sat with her hands folded in front of her and her back straight, and she looked at the witnesses and the prosecutor and the judge with the composed attention of a woman who had decided to be present for every moment of this, regardless of what the moments contained. She did not look at me during Sandra's testimony. She did not look at me during Carol's. When Warren testified, I saw her jaw tighten once, just slightly, and then release. She looked at me twice. The first time was when she came in and found my face in the second row. Her composure shifted for exactly 1 second. Something moved through her eyes that was too large and too fast to name a flash of something raw and unguarded, and then she gathered herself and looked away. The second time was when the prosecutor read the full charge sheet aloud. Criminal conspiracy. Elder financial abuse. Administration of a controlled substance without consent. Obstruction of justice. Her name was attached to each count in the flat official language of federal indictment, and each count landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. She turned and found me in the second row. She looked at me with her eyes bright and her jaw set and her hands still folded in front of her, and I held her gaze because she deserved that. because whatever had broken between us, she had still been the person who mattered most to me for 45 years. Because looking away would have been a cruelty I was not willing to add to the accounting. We looked at each other across a federal courtroom, and I saw in her face all the things that could not be said here. The 45 years of mornings, the arguments about nothing, the laughter in the dark, the terrible weight of a mother's love applied in the wrong direction. And I did not look away until the prosecutor finished reading and the judge looked up from the bench. Before sentencing, the judge said, "The court has been informed that the victim wishes to make a statement." He looked toward me. "Mr. Holt, you may proceed when you're ready." The room turned toward me. Frank put his hand briefly on my shoulder from the seat beside me. His palm was warm and steady, and it rested there for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to say what it needed to say, and then he lifted it. I put both hands on the bench in front of me and pushed myself to my feet. My knee protested the way it always did. I took my cane, I straightened my jacket. I looked at the judge and then at the room and then for just a moment at Evelyn. She was looking back at me. Her eyes were full, not spilling over, just full the way eyes get when a person is holding something too large for the space available. And her hands were still folded in front of her, and her back was still straight, and she looked like the woman I had married, and also like someone I was seeing clearly for the first time, and I understood that both of those things were true and would remain true for whatever came next. I took a breath, and I began. I did not use notes. I had written things down and crossed them out and written them again over the course of 3 months in the notebook I kept at the drafting table, in the margins of project manuals on the back of an envelope I found in my coat pocket. One Tuesday morning, when Frank and I were eating pasta at the kitchen table, I had written towards something and never quite reached it, and eventually I had understood that the reason I couldn't reach it on paper was because it wasn't a written thing. It was a spoken thing, and it would only find its shape in the room where it needed to be said. I stood at the front of the courtroom with my cane, and I looked at the judge, and I spoke. "I don't stand here today as a victim," I said. "I stand here as a man who spent 45 years building something with someone, and who learned late and painfully that even the strongest foundation can crack from within." The courtroom was very still. I loved my wife. I love my son. That love does not disappear because of what happened here, and I want the court to understand that I am not asking for maximum punishment out of anger because I am not angry. I am grieving. There is a difference. I paused. What was done to me was wrong. It was carefully planned, and it was executed without my knowledge, and it would have taken from me everything I had built over a lifetime. That is also true. I can hold both of those things at once. I have had 3 months to practice. I looked at Evelyn. She was looking back at me with her hands folded and her eyes full and her back straight, and she looked like the woman I had married, and also like someone I was meeting for the first time, and I understood that both of those things were true and would remain true for whatever came after this. "I have nothing else to say," I said, "except that I hope when the time comes that everyone in this room finds their way back to something worth building." I sat down. Frank put his hand on my arm and left it there. The judge sentenced Evelyn to 7 years. Derek, under his cooperation agreement, received 3. Dr. Warren Pitts received 4 years and the permanent revocation of his medical license. Victor Salazar received 12. The clerk read each sentence into the record in the flat official voice of someone for whom these numbers are procedural rather than devastating, and I sat in the second row and received each one and placed it where it needed to go. When it was done, the room began to move. The federal marshals came for Evelyn. She rose from the defense table without being asked, the way she had done everything in this courtroom, with composure, with her back straight, with the particular dignity of a woman who had made catastrophic choices and intended to carry them without spectacle. The marshal touched her arm, and she turned toward the side door. She stopped. 3 steps from the door, she stopped and turned and looked back across the courtroom until she found me in the second row. The room held its breath. "Raymond," she said. My name. Just my name. The same word she had said 10,000 times, worn smooth by decades of ordinary use, and underneath the smoothness every version of it I had ever heard. Called across the yard, whispered in the dark, said with exasperation and tenderness, and the accumulated weight of 45 years. "I did love you," she said. "I need you to know that." My throat closed completely. "I know you did, Evelyn," I said. "That's what makes this so hard." Something in her face broke open and came back together in the same instant. She held my gaze for one more second, Then she turned and walked through the door, and it closed behind her, and she was gone. December came quietly. The oak tree in the front yard stood bare against the gray sky, its branches making the particular pattern against winter light that I had looked at from my study window for 30 years and never tired of. The crooked bird feeder had a new coat of paint. Frank had done it one Tuesday afternoon, without being asked, showing up with a brush and a can of forest green, and finishing the job in 40 minutes, while I made coffee and pretended not to watch. I was in the study when Sandra knocked. She was at the front door with a bunch of yellow flowers, not roses, something smaller and more practical, the kind you buy from the bucket outside the grocery store on your way somewhere, and she looked slightly uncertain in the way of someone who is not sure if they are welcome. "I was in the neighborhood," she said. "I wanted to see how you were doing." "Come in," I said. "I just made coffee." She stepped inside and looked around the foyer with the careful curiosity of someone entering a place they have imagined but not seen, and I watched her take it in the architectural drawings on the wall, the old coat rack by the door, the photograph of Evelyn on the hall table that I had not moved and was not yet certain I would move, and she did not comment on any of it, which was exactly right. We sat at the kitchen table with our coffee and we talked about ordinary things, her work, the weather, a book she was reading, the new family that had moved into the building across from hers. After a while she asked, "Are you okay, really?" I looked at my coffee mug, the blue ceramic one I had been drinking from since 1987. Then I looked up at the kitchen window, where the rosemary plant still leaned toward the winter light. "I'm working on it," I said. "That's the honest answer." She nodded, accepting this without pushing, and lifted her mug. Later, when she had gone and the house was quiet again, I put on my coat and went out to the front porch and stood in the December cold and looked at the oak tree and the bare street and the low gray sky. 65 years old, a cane, a house I had built with my own hands and nearly lost, a wife in federal custody, a son beginning the long work of becoming someone worth being, a friend who showed up on Tuesdays with pasta and paintbrushes, a young woman who had kept a promise to her grandmother and in doing so had kept everything for me. I thought about what I had said in the courtroom. I hope everyone finds their way back to something worth building. I reached out and put my hand on the porch railing, solid wood, 30 years old, holding firm, and I looked at the street and I breathed the cold December air into my lungs and I let it be exactly what it was. Not resolved, not finished, but standing, still standing. Looking back on everything that happened, I understand now that this was not just my story. This is a family story that plays out in silence in kitchens and living rooms, and signed documents in the spaces between people who love each other and have stopped being honest. I was 65 years old. I used a cane. They believed that made me easy. They were wrong. If there is one thing I have learned from this family betrayal, it is that age sharpens you if you let it. Every year is a tool. Every scar is a blueprint. And I believe I have always believed that God does not give us more than we can carry, only more than we expected to carry. My advice, if you are living inside a family story that feels like mine, do not wait. Do not explain yourself to people who have already decided what you are. Find your Frank, find your Sandra, and document everything. This family betrayal cost me 45 years of certainty. What it gave me in return was something I had not known I was missing. Clarity. If any part of this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone you love, or someone you need to protect, or simply reminded you that strength has no age, leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed so you never miss a story that matters, thank you so much for staying until the end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and inspiration. If this isn't the content for you, we completely respect that. Feel free to explore whatever speaks to your heart.